The gavel had not even fallen yet, and already Judge Eleanor Hayes felt something was wrong with this case. If you have ever watched a courtroom fall silent, not from boredom, but from something closer to reverence, then you already know the kind of morning this was about to become. Before you go any further, if this story moves you even a little, hit like and subscribe, because what happens in this courtroom will stay with you long after the video ends. Marcus Webb sat at the defense table, with his hands folded so tightly. He was 38 years old, a mechanic by trade, a widower by tragedy, and, according to the stack of papers in front of the prosecution, a man who did not deserve to raise his own daughter. Marcus wore a suit that did not quite fit him, borrowed from his neighbor for the occasion, because he had never owned one himself. His hands, scarred and calloused from a decade of engine grease and steel, trembled slightly as he stared at the seal on the courtroom wall. 6 years earlier, Marcus had lost his wife, Diane, to a car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside of Millbrook. Their daughter, Lily, was 2 years old at the time, and Marcus, gutted by grief he could not put into words, had done the only thing he knew how to do. He kept going. He ran Webb's Auto Repair, the shop his own father had built with his hands, and he raised Lily alone, teaching her to ride a bike in the gravel lot behind the garage, packing her lunches with notes tucked inside, and falling asleep most nights in the recliner, because the silence of his bedroom had never stopped feeling too big. Millbrook was the kind of town where everyone knew your name, and more importantly, everyone knew your story. Marcus Webb was known as the man who fixed your car for free if you were a single mother who couldn't pay, who quietly covered a stranger's grocery bill at the register when their card declined, who show up at 2 a.m. with jumper cables if you called him, no questions asked. He never spoke of these things. He did them the way some people breathe, without thinking, without needing anyone to notice. But someone had noticed, and that someone wanted him gone. Richard Colton was not from Millbrook. He had arrived 3 years earlier with a briefcase full of development plans, and a smile that never reached his eyes. Colton Development Group had been buying up land along the old highway, promising jobs, promising progress, promising a shining new shopping plaza that would put Millbrook on the map. There was only one problem. Webb's Auto Repair sat directly in the center of the parcel Colton needed, and Marcus had refused 3 times to sell. "It's not about the money," Marcus had told him the last time Colton came by, sliding yet another offer across the counter. This one nearly double the property's worth. "My father built this place, with his own hands. My daughter plays in that lot. Some things aren't for sale. I just haven't found yours yet." 3 months later, Marcus was arrested. The charges were dizzying in their construction. Embezzlement from a community fund he had once helped organize, a falsified insurance claim on a repair job, and worst of all, an accusation from a man named Curtis Boone, a mechanic Marcus had once employed and later fired for stealing parts, that Marcus had assaulted him in the garage after hours. There were no witnesses to the alleged assault, though buried under 3 shell companies. Embezzlement garage. And then came the custody petition. Diane's parents, the Whitfields, who had never approved of their daughter marrying a mechanic instead of the lawyer they'd hoped for, filed for emergency custody of Lily, citing Marcus's pending criminal charges and pattern of financial instability. The Whitfields had money. The Whitfields had lawyers. And now, it seemed, the Whitfields had a reason. To understand why an entire town would eventually rise to defend Marcus Webb, you first had to understand what Millbrook looked like in the years right after Diane died. Marcus had not always been the steady, generous man people knew now. In the first year after the accident, he had been hollow, showing up late to open the shop, snapping at customers, letting invoices pile up on his desk, because some days just getting Lily dressed and fed felt like climbing a mountain. His sister, Karen, drove over 3 nights a week just to make sure there was food in the refrigerator and that Marcus had slept at all. It was Karen who finally sat him down at that same kitchen table months after the funeral, and told him something he never forgot. He started small, fixing a flat tire for an elderly widow down the street, and refusing payment, driving a teenager home late one night after her car broke down, rather than letting her walk the dark highway alone. Each small act seemed to loosen something in his chest that grief had wound too tight. He never set out to become the man Millbrook would one day defend in a courtroom. He simply kept choosing, morning after morning, to be the kind of father and neighbor Diane would have been proud of, even on the days he didn't believe he deserved to feel proud of anything at all. By the time Richard Colton arrived in town with his briefcase and his offers, Marcus Webb had quietly become something Millbrook didn't have a name for. Not a hero, not a saint, just a fixed point that people could orient themselves around when their own lives came apart. That was the man Colton was about to underestimate. Marcus sat in that courtroom, not just fighting for his freedom, but fighting to keep the only piece of Diane he had left. His public defender, a soft-spoken young woman named Angela Reyes, had warned him honestly, on their first meeting, "They've built a narrative, Mr. Webb. Financially unstable. They've built a narrative, Mr. Webb. Financially unstable. Violent temper. If we can't dismantle that narrative piece by piece, I'm not going to lie to you. This could go very badly." Marcus had nodded slowly and said the only thing he had left to hold on to. "Then let the truth do the talking. I've never hurt anyone in my life. Somebody in this town will know that." He had no idea how right he was about to be proven, or how strange it would look to everyone in that room, including the judge herself. The trial began on a gray Tuesday morning, named Foster Grant, clearly not a local hire, opened with confidence. He painted Marcus as a man drowning in debt, desperate enough to defraud a community fund, unstable enough to attack a former employee, unfit enough to raise a child alone. Curtis Boone took the stand first. He wore a neck brace that seemed to appear only for the cameras outside the courthouse, and he described, in halting, rehearsed sentences, how Marcus had snapped one evening, after Boone confronted him about missing wages. Judge Hayes watched him carefully. Something about his testimony felt stiff, memorized, like a script recited one too many times in a mirror. "Can you tell the court what time this occurred?" Boone hesitated. Around 7, maybe 8. "Interesting," Angela said, sliding a printed page toward the bailiff. "Because we have time-stamped security footage from the gas station across the street from Webb's Auto Repair, showing Mr. Webb's truck leaving the lot at 5:47 p.m. that evening, and not returning until the following morning. He was at his daughter's school play. There are over 60 witnesses, including the school principal, who can confirm Mr. Webb was in the auditorium. From 6 o'clock onward. Over the following days, the prosecution called witness after witness, each one intended to reinforce the portrait of Marcus Webb as unstable, dishonest, dangerous. And one by one, something began to happen that not even Foster Grant could have predicted. The witnesses started telling the truth, the whole truth. And the truth was not what anyone in that courtroom expected. Grant called Rosa Delgado, the treasurer of the community fund Marcus had allegedly embezzled from, expecting her to confirm discrepancies in the ledger. Instead, Rosa, an elderly woman with silver hair and steady hands, Rosa, the only discrepancy in that fund is the $4,000 he put in. Anonymously, the winter little Tommy Alvarez needed surgery, and the fund came up short. I only found out it was him because I saw his truck outside the bank at 6 a.m., before I'd even unlocked the doors. Grant, flustered, tried to redirect. "Ms. Delgado, please just answer the question about the missing." "There is no missing money," Rosa said firmly. "There's only a man too proud to let anyone know what he does for this town." Judge Hayes made a note. It was a small note, just 3 words, but she underlined them twice. Not what expected. Next came Deborah Ashworth, a bank loan officer Grant hoped would testify to Marcus's financial instability. Late payments, overdue notices, a man on the edge of ruin. Deborah took the stand, adjusted her glasses, and said something that made even Grant blink in confusion. "Mr. Webb has never missed a loan payment in 11 years, she said. In fact, 3 years ago he came into my office and asked me, very quietly, if there was a way to set up an anonymous fund inside the bank so that struggling families in town could apply for small emergency loans without anyone knowing who was backing it. He funds it personally, every month, and asked me, very quietly, if I wasn't supposed to say that in public today. I don't think he wanted anyone to know, but I think it's time somebody said it." The gallery had gone completely silent. Judge Hayes leaned forward, her pen hovering over her notepad, no longer writing. By the 4th day, something had shifted in that courtroom that Foster Grant could feel slipping through his fingers like water. He called a mechanic named Pete Simmons, a former rival shop owner who had once publicly feuded with Marcus over a customer dispute. Hoping Pete would testify to Marcus's supposed temper, Pete sat down, loosened his collar, and said, "Look, I didn't even want to be here. Then my son got sick, real sick, cancer, the kind that empties your bank account in a month. Marcus showed up at my house with an envelope, $6,000, cash. He said, 'We don't have to be friends, Pete, but nobody watches their kids suffer if I can help it.' I tried to give it back. He wouldn't take it. So no, I'm not going to sit here and lie and say this man has a temper. He's got the biggest heart I've ever seen wrapped in the grumpiest face in Millbrook. Counselor Grant, I would like to understand something." Judge Hayes finally spoke, her voice measured but unmistakably curious. "Counselor Grant, you have now called 4 witnesses intending to establish a pattern of instability, dishonesty, or violence in the defendant. Each one has instead provided sworn testimony of generosity, integrity, and community trust. Do you have an explanation for this pattern?" Grant, for the first time in the trial, had no immediate answer. There was one more witness that day, whom nobody in the courtroom had expected to see called at all. Marcus's own daughter's 2nd-grade teacher, Ms. Patricia Nolan. Nolan folded her hands on the witness stand and spoke with the calm certainty of someone who had waited a long time to say something in public. "Mr. Webb has missed exactly 1 school event in 6 years, she said, and that was the week his own father passed away. Every other morning, rain or shine, he is the first parent in the pickup line, and most weeks he stays an extra 20 minutes, helping other parents' cars that won't start in the cold. I have taught in this town for 22 years, Your Honor. I can count on one hand the number of fathers I have seen show up the way Marcus Webb shows up for that little girl." By the time she stepped down, Foster Grant had stopped taking notes altogether, simply staring at the growing stack of testimony that had, witness by witness, transformed his own case into something closer to a tribute. That night, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, long after Lily had gone to sleep, staring at the wall, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Angela had told him things were turning, but he didn't feel victory. He felt exposed, like the private parts of his life, the quiet things he had done because they mattered, not because anyone should know, were being unwrapped in public one layer at a time. "Those things I did, they weren't for credit. If people start seeing me as some kind of saint, they're going to expect me to be perfect, and I'm not. I'm just a guy who couldn't stand watching people struggle the way Diane and I struggled before the shop took off." Angela studied him for a long moment. "Marcus, that's exactly why it's working. You're not performing generosity for a jury. You lived it for years when no one was watching. That's the one thing Colton's money can't fake." The 5th day of the trial brought the moment that would define the entire case. The moment Judge Eleanor Hayes would later describe in her private notes as the moment she understood exactly what was happening in her courtroom, and why every witness kept protecting the single dad sitting quietly at the defense table. Foster Grant, increasingly desperate, called his final and supposedly strongest witness, Harold Whitfield, Diane's father, the man leading the custody petition against Marcus, Harold Whitfield, Diane's father. He believed, deep in his bones, that his daughter had married beneath her station, and that her death had been, in some unspoken way, tangled up with the modest life Marcus had offered her, instead of the comfortable one Harold believed she deserved. Grant walked Harold through his prepared testimony: Marcus's unstable finances, the criminal charges, the alleged temper, all building toward the recommendation that Lily be removed from Marcus's custody immediately. Then Angela rose for cross-examination and asked a single quiet question. "Mr. Whitfield, were you aware that 8 months ago Marcus called you at 2 in the morning? Mr. Whitfield, were you aware that 8 months ago Marcus called you at 2 in the morning?" "Your Honor," Angela said gently, "I believe it's entirely relevant to this custody determination." She turned back to Harold. "Please tell the court why Marcus Webb called you that night." Harold was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its courtroom polish. "My wife had a heart attack. We live 40 minutes from the nearest hospital with a cardiac unit. Marcus drove her himself. His truck was faster than waiting for an ambulance on those back roads. He carried her into the emergency room himself, sat with me in the waiting room until 4 in the morning, never said a word about it afterward, never brought it up." "And is that the man you've described in your custody petition as unstable and unfit?" Angela asked softly. Harold Whitfield, 71 years old, a man who had spent 3 years convincing himself he despised his son-in-law, put his face in his hands and wept in front of the entire courtroom. "No," he said finally, his voice breaking. "That is not the man I put in that petition. That petition was written out of grief and pride, and I let a lawyer I never should have trusted convince me it was justice. My daughter chose Marcus because he loved her the way she deserved to be loved, and he has raised my granddaughter with more patience and devotion." I withdraw all of it. There was no laughter this time, just silence, thick and reverent, the kind that follows a truth too long buried finally breaking the surface. Judge Hayes called a recess. In her chambers, alone, she reviewed her notes from the past 5 days. Rosa Delgado's $4,000, Deborah Ashworth's anonymous loan fund, Pete Simmons's $6,000 in cash, Harold Whitfield's tearful confession, 14 families helped quietly, countless nights given without asking for anything back. She understood, finally, why every witness had ended up protecting Marcus Webb. It was not coordination. It was not coincidence. It was simply the truth, surfacing again and again from every direction, because a decade of quiet decency leaves fingerprints on more lives than any one man realizes. When court resumed, the final blow to the prosecution's case came not from Angela, but from an unexpected source, a forensic accountant Angela had hired to trace the shell companies, funding Curtis Boone's legal representation. The trail, after weeks of careful work, led directly back to Colton Development Group, and further, to a wire transfer made the same week Boone had filed his assault claim, a transfer explicitly labeled, in Colton's own internal records, as Webb Acquisition Incentive. Richard Colton had not simply wanted Marcus's land. He had engineered an entire legal assault to force him out. False charges, a bought witness even, it was later revealed, a quiet phone call to Harold Whitfield's lawyer, suggesting the custody angle in the first place, knowing exactly how to exploit an old man's grief. He never returned to finish his closing argument. Within the hour, the district attorney's office announced it was dropping all charges against Marcus Webb and opening a new investigation, this time into Richard Colton and Colton Development Group for witness tampering, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Judge Eleanor Hayes delivered her final remarks, not as a formality, but as something the entire courtroom seemed to lean forward to hear. "In 18 years on this bench," she said, "I have rarely witnessed a case where the truth arrived not through evidence alone, but through the sheer, undeniable weight of a community's memory. Mr. Webb, you stand acquitted of all charges." She said, "I have rarely witnessed a case where the truth arrived not through evidence alone, but through the sheer undeniable weight. Of a community's memory. Mr. Webb, you stand acquitted of all charges. But I want to say something outside the boundaries of this ruling, if the court will permit me a moment of candor. Whatever kind of man inspires 4 separate witnesses, 3 of them called by the very prosecution seeking to convict him, to instead stand up in a court of law and defend his character without prompting, without rehearsal, and at personal risk to their own testimony, that is not a man the state should ever have doubted in the first place. This court is adjourned. The gallery erupted, not in the chaotic way of television courtrooms, but in something quieter and more powerful. Genuine, overwhelming relief. Even Harold Whitfield crossed the aisle, extending a hand that Marcus, after a long moment of hesitation, finally shook. "I'm sorry," Harold said quietly, "for all of it." "You were grieving," Marcus replied. "So was I. We just did it differently." Outside the courthouse, rain had finally given way to a pale, washed-out sunlight breaking through the clouds. Lily, who had spent the trial with Marcus's sister, came running across the courthouse lawn. The moment she saw him on the steps, small enough. "Are we going home, Daddy?" she asked, her small hands pressed against his cheeks. "Yeah, baby," Marcus said, his voice thick. "We're going home." Behind them, on the courthouse steps, Angela Reyes watched the 2 of them walk toward the parking lot, hand in hand, and felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel after a trial. Certainty that justice, however slow and however costly, had actually found its way to the right place. In the months that followed, Millbrook changed in small but meaningful ways. Sir Richard Colton's development deal collapsed entirely under the weight of the fraud investigation, and Colton himself would later face indictment on multiple charges, his name becoming a quiet local warning about what money can attempt to buy and what it can never actually purchase. Webb's Auto Repair remained exactly where it had always stood, and if anything, business tripled. Not because people suddenly needed more oil changes, but because an entire town wanted, in whatever small way they could, to give something back to a man who had spent a decade giving without ever asking for recognition. Marcus never talked about the trial much. He still didn't like the attention, still deflected when customers thanked him for things he considered simply the right thing to do. But something had shifted in him too. He no longer hid the good he did quite so carefully. When Rosa Delgado's grandson needed braces the family couldn't afford, Marcus didn't sneak the money into an envelope in the dead of night. He walked into the dentist's office himself, in daylight, and paid the bill at the counter because he had finally begun to understand something Angela had tried to tell him. Months earlier, quiet decency, once seen, does not lose its meaning. If anything, it multiplies, giving others permission to be generous too, in their own quiet ways. Harold and his wife began visiting every other weekend, not out of obligation, but because Lily had asked for her grandfather, and because Harold, for the first time in years, wanted to know the man his daughter had loved enough to build a life with. On warm evenings, he would sit in a folding chair by the garage while Marcus worked, watching his granddaughter chase fireflies across the gravel lot, and he would think, quietly, about how close he had come to losing all of it, over pride he could no longer even fully explain. Judge Eleanor Hayes kept a framed copy of her closing remarks in her chambers. In 20 years on the bench since, she has told colleagues, she has never seen another case quite like it. A defendant who said almost nothing in his own defense, because he didn't need to. The truth had already been living in the town around him the entire time, waiting patiently for someone to finally ask the right questions. And Marcus Webb, the single dad who never wanted anyone to know what he did in the dark, learned that some truths cannot stay hidden forever. Not because they are loud, but because they are lived out, quietly. One small act of kindness at a time, until an entire town rises, almost involuntarily. Years later, when Lily was old enough to understand what had happened that spring, she asked her father why so many people had stood up for him in that courtroom. Marcus thought about it for a long moment, the way he thought about most things, slowly and carefully, before he answered. "I didn't do any of it thinking someone would return the favor," he told her. "I did it because your mom taught me that the people around us are worth showing up for, even when nobody's watching. Turns out, people remember that, even when you've forgotten you ever did it." Lily grew up in that same gravel lot behind Webb's Auto Repair, and when she was old enough, she started helping out on weekends, learning to change oil and rotate tires, the way her father once taught her to ride a bike. On the wall of the shop office, framed beside a photograph of Diane, hung a single page from the local newspaper. Not the headline about the trial, which Marcus had never wanted printed at all, but a smaller article from months later, one about the Whitfield family's donation to a new community emergency fund, established in memory of a woman named Diane Webb, and administered quietly. Richard Colton's name would surface once more in Millbrook, years afterward, in a small item buried on page 6 of the regional paper announcing his sentencing. Nobody in town read it with satisfaction so much as quiet closure, a final period at the end of a sentence that had, for one terrifying season, threatened to rewrite the entire story of a father and his daughter. Marcus never mentioned it. He was already back under the hood of a customer's truck by the time the paper hit the stands, hands stained with grease, radio playing low, his daughter's laughter drifting in from the gravel lot outside, exactly where it belonged. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us who we really are